My name is Andrew George. I'm currently located in Durham, North Carolina, and my background is in biology. So I started as a researcher focusing on understanding many different things around biology, how students actually understand and engage with biology as a education researcher for a little bit. And then I got really into the cell and molecular biology for quite some time. I did my PhD at Duke University and focused on understanding how genes control cell movement in different organisms. And so you're probably asking yourself, okay, that's interesting, but how is that relevant, and or how did you get here, right? In terms of being at this workshop and doing this type of work. And while I was in graduate school, there was an impact from the federal government shutdown. So in 2013, government in the United States shut down because of a lot of political issues, but that really impacted the federal funding. There was a bunch of decreases across the board. It was called sequestration. And so my lab ended up losing funding, and I had to switch from what I was doing to a completely different lab that actually had money for research. Anyway, I'll get into that story in a little bit when I go through my science policy journey. But another piece to acknowledge is that I am the co-founder of the North Carolina STEM Policy Fellowship. So it's good to see some other state level policy fellow groups represented here. I spent some time as the executive vice president for strategy for Scribner at the federal level. And then finally, currently, I am on a civic science fellowship with the Rita Allen Foundation at Sigma Xi. So as I mentioned, my science policy journey started back in 2013 as a student. I was very frustrated by the fact that the federal government had made a decision that, of course, impacted a ton of researchers, as well as just people in general, right? Cutting by almost 10% the budgets of almost every agency, just carte blanche. And so I began getting involved in more advocacy work as a graduate student, focused primarily on, apologies, I have two screens. I meant to say that at the beginning. So if I look over here, it's just different notes. But I will try my best to not be too distracted. And so I served as the director of advocacy for our graduate and professional students. I was the Southeast Regional Chair for the National Association of Grad and Professional Students, and our goals were really around open access for research, advocating for student visa reform, because it's a huge issue for how we actually engage and retain talent in the United States, as well as increasing and or maintaining funding for federally funded research. And as I was engaging in that work, I started to recognize that the only opportunities that were presented for graduate students in science policy or in the natural sciences, where I'm from, in biology, were primarily at the federal level. The AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship was like one avenue, but every time that I went to a career panel about how do you get involved in this as a scientist, they pretty much just always said just to do the AAAS Policy Fellowship. And I felt like there should be more opportunities, especially as we consider state and local issues in the United States. And so I essentially started and established the North Carolina STEM Policy Fellowship with funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. They gave us a small grant, and I did this while I was in graduate school, despite the lack of excitement from my advisor. So my work, as I mentioned, was on cell and molecular biology. It is not on how do we fix and or improve and engage scientists in the policymaking process. But I am happy to say that the fellowship launched in 2020 with its two fellows and has expanded every year since. And this year, actually, we also got a 3-year investment from philanthropy to continue the fellowship on forward. We've trained a number of students on how to get into and created a pathway for students to get into, or recent graduates in North Carolina, to engage with the state government as a meaningful opportunity to understand how to impact policy with their research training. But as I was also developing this, I also needed a job. This was not a thing that I was getting paid to do. And I was looking around for opportunities in science policy that weren't the AAAS fellowship because I didn't qualify at the time. And I was fortunate enough to be brought on board and hired by a strategy consulting firm named Scribner. And so I spent 3 years at Scribner working on federal policy and eventually became the executive vice president of strategy there, where I led a lot of strategic efforts at the federal level, with working primarily with NOAA as our major client, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And I know we have international groups. So the focus there is, of course, on climate and environmental work. They also are responsible for the United States weather forecasts And so as I worked with them, I had to facilitate and work with and write up a number of cross-functional or cross-topic, cross-agency initiatives or strategic efforts, ranging from how are we going to engage with the academic community on integrating innovation from the academic community and industry into the weather enterprise, which had been structured in a way that was not conducive to that, just for historical reasons. As far as, and also sort of integrating climate information into the decision-making process for fisheries management. So a lot of experience across different topics and leading and or coordinating. It was a really cool place to be, to learn and be an observer. As a consultant, you are hardly ever the decision maker. And so it is an interesting place to be to learn about the different motivations, which you will hear about from Eric later on. So a lot of the techniques and topics that Eric is talking about are extremely important as you try to navigate these different cultures and motivations. And so from there, I had a personal interest, as it sort of started at the beginning, in state and local policy, because as you get into the federal level, there are the conversations, at least in the United States. I want to make sure I'm clear. My experience is based almost exclusively in the United States. Eric has a really great breadth of experience internationally that I know he'll be able to share later. But in the United States, there's a lot of focus in the research community on the federal level. However, there's an opening and an opportunity at the state and local level to have a larger or a potentially larger impact, and the needs also greater. And so when I had the opportunity to come back to North Carolina, a place where I got married, I bought my first house and all kinds of really important life experiences, I jumped at it. And so the project that I'm currently working on is to develop a digital platform to build sustained relationships between policymakers and scientists or researchers at the state level in North Carolina. And as part of that work, one of the pieces that we've developed in relationship to the North Carolina STEM Policy Fellowship is I've led the development of a 4-day intensive boot camp focused on understanding all of the different components of state government and or just government in general, the 3 different branches in the United States, and how you can actually engage with that in different and meaningful ways. So a lot of the opportunities presented to researchers fall heavily in the advocacy space. Before I start defining those things, I'll go ahead and jump into my next slide, which is to define science policy, right? So science policy is a word that's often thrown around, but is seldom clearly articulated as far as what you are actually hoping to be involved in and how you want to be involved in it. And where you want to be involved very much depends on how you're going to do that, right? So I define this, and others have as well, as having 3 very distinct components. You have science advocacy, you have science for policy, and then you have policy for science. And a number of you are very experienced in this, so I'm telling you things you probably already know. But just wanted to make sure that we're all working from the same definitions as we go through the remainder of this program. And so for definition purposes, science advocacy is public support for or a recommendation of a particular cause or policy. So if you are very specifically saying, I need you to pass this bill, or I think you should do X, then you are engaged in science advocacy. Science for policy is where you are bringing scientific expertise or findings, summaries of existing evidence as the basis for the development of policy. And ideally, in this case, you're providing multiple options or recommendations for what can be done. And then finally, policy for science, which is essentially how I ended up in this work, unintentionally, not because I was working on policy for science, but policies around science really impacted the work that I was doing. And so this is government laws, regulations that affect the practice of science. And so you can think of this in the context of any sort of funding, who gets to do science, where it's done, by whom, what topic areas are focused on. That's sort of the policy for science area. And so just quick examples from my background. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this, I started this work in science advocacy. So I spent years advocating for the passage of the Fair Access to Science and Technology Research Act. That act never ended up passing, but however, this year, August 25th, 2022, a version of this was issued as an executive order, which essentially makes publicly funded research in the United States available immediately on publication. Previously, there was a 12-month embargo. And this brings it down to 0. One really important distinction here, of course, is that this is an executive order and it can be changed by any administration moving forward, and it's just a guidance. And the goal of the FASTER Act was to codify it in law and make it more difficult and or long-lasting for the future. But this is a place where we were advocating for something very specific. This is what we want to happen. Science for policy. I'm going to use environmental examples just because that's what I'm most familiar with, but there are going to be many other ones that I'm sure you'll be able to contribute and or focus on that are applicable from your work. But here's an example of the air quality index. It's a uniform system used by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to report pollution levels for airport pollutants that are regulated under the Clean Air Act, right? So these have a scientific basis. There's quantitative evidence underlying them for what these impacts are and the concerns that are associated with them. And this, of course, informs how we implement and or execute policy. So taking action for when people are over these limits, permitting them to produce certain amounts or expel certain amounts of air pollutants. And then finally, there's also really important area, and because you're participating in this workshop, I think you're recognizing the importance of thinking about how your research, whether you want to engage in policy or not, thinking about how your research could be used, whether you choose to or not, because you don't have a choice necessarily in that matter. If you're putting it out there, anybody can take it up. And so one example of where science for policy has unintended consequences is, if anybody's interested in this article, I'm happy to link it in the slides so you'll have it after. And I'm not going to do it perfect justice, but there was researchers who had created essentially this a scale or a rating for how healthy were your kidneys. And so it depends on how you interpret their assessment. So Jordan is a biracial individual. He has 1 Black grandparent and 3 white grandparents. And if you choose to consider Jordan as white, he will have a GFR, which is just the score, of 17. And this means it's low enough to be able to put him on the donor registry and he can get in line for a transplant. However, because of numbers that maybe didn't have a great evidence base, if you consider him as a Black individual, his GFR score is 21. And so he won't be placed on said registry list. And so they're grappling with this realization that this sort of black box algorithm underlying this particular rating system doesn't have any sort of basis in fact, but the science for policy implications are that many people, because of this research, have been excluded from donor registry lists, whether they intended to be or intended these consequences or not. Sure, yeah, exactly. Like concussions in football, or there's other examples, O2, I'm a biologist by training, so O2 sensors as well are less effective because they were developed in a different way, although that has a really complicated history too. And when you look into it, you'll see all of these places where we definitely, as scientists and researchers, it's important for us to recognize how this work is going to be essentially have impacts outside of the lab that we're working in, and be proactive about engaging people that might be impacted. And that'll be part of Eric's, what we go through today as well. And then finally, in the United States, a very current example of a policy for science is that we are making historic investments in the production of semiconductors and other potential issues or other areas of interest under the CHIPS Act. So a lot of this comes down to funding, but also you can have essentially the thing I mentioned at the beginning and referenced as advocacy is also an example of policy for science. So you have to make your research available immediately after publication is an example of how we think science should be done. And so with that, I heard at the beginning of this that we have at least some people from the scientific or research community. We have others that are from the engineering community. And of course, we've got others that are from the policy community. And I put together this slide specifically to articulate that there are a lot of similarities in the approaches that are taken in these different groups. So scientists ask a question, engineers define the problem, a policy process also sort of identifies a problem. And so there's similar mechanisms or similar sort of structure to how we approach the policy process and the scientific process. Oh, that's a great question, Joan. I don't have specific slides on the honest broker paradigm versus the advocate in this slide deck, but that's a good place. We can happy to have that in the reflections piece. And a good distinction to make for a decision you have to make about how you want to engage in the policy process as a researcher, for sure. So you do some of your background research in all three of these processes. You make a hypothesis, or in the policy case, you're defining the agenda or you're specifying your requirements, and then you begin to test it. And so, and this sort of the policy process places developing your policy ideas. Eventually you have to pass it, and you'll go through this iterative cycle. And that's an important point to recognize for all of these, that they are iterative cycles. It doesn't just end, right? The policy process is continually evolving and updating, which means that you can continue at any point, you can enter into the process, right? There are better places to enter, but you can always, there's always time and or an opportunity for you to participate. And it's extremely important for you to recognize where, for a particular issue you're interested in, where you are in the policy process, so that you know how to effectively engage. If you're at the identifying phase, then obviously there's a particular type of expertise that you can provide. If you're at the implementation phase, it's a very different set of things or considerations. And so this will be provided to you, and you can sort of look into the details. I know the text is pretty small on this, but the main point here is that there's a lot of similarities. But one of the big differences between these, although they look structurally similar, the cultures that we are represented, or the prevailing culture in these two different groups of policymaking versus science, are very different. And that has a meaningful impact on how you engage and think about how you engage with those different processes. So for example, in science, the currency, or the thing that we use or trade on, is publications and grants primarily. Those are the primary currency for career advancement, for recognition. In policy, it's relationships and sway. So what kind of relationships do you have? What kind of authority and or decision-making power do you have? What kind of coalitions have you built or are you a part of? It's very relationship and sort of community driven, versus in the scientific publication grants is very individualistic. Timelines, scientists often work on long-term projects that span multiple years. Policymakers, while they also span multiple years in terms of election cycles, they're usually dealing with issues on the timeline or scale of days, and or need information on the scale of days. Certainty. We have science uncertainty is accepted. It's an understood part of the process, that we're not always certain, that there's probabilities, there's statistics. Whereas in policy, certainty is preferred. We want to know what's going to happen. We want to know that it's going to have the impact that we want it to have, because there's a lot at risk, right? When you're implementing a large scale federal program for millions and millions of people, you want to know that it's going to work. In the scientific process, when it's pilots and smaller groups, you can have a lot more flexibility to take risks. Primary communication. Scientists often love to communicate in technical language and long-form publications. Policymakers don't read long-form publications often, nor do they read or enjoy technical language. And so for them, stories, one-pagers, slide decks are the primary mechanism and or mode of communication when you're engaging with or interacting with a policymaker. Evidence. In science, data, research, literature. So at the very top of that cycle of forming a hypothesis on the previous slide, data and research are the primary inputs, let's say, of how you decide what your hypothesis is going to be. Policy, we've got research, we've got beliefs, we've got constraints, economic or geographic, all of these other considerations that are being considered as part of the decision-making process. I do want to make one really specific point here, is that often scientists will not acknowledge that values are also informing their choice of evidence and what they consider. And so there's a lot more shared experience there. Science is just often, promoted that we are an objective, and we try to be, but we're all humans doing the work. And so the choices we make and what we value and find is interesting is informing what we also pursue. And so those are more value-based than we would initially like to believe. And it's important to recognize that in the work that you're doing, because it's not like policymakers are just considering things that you're not. Scientists are also doing that as well. Purpose. In general, science's purpose is around discovery. And in policy, it's around mission. It's around connecting and or providing a service to a community. It's about solving a particular problem or helping create a future for a particular group. Versus science, it's a very curiosity-driven endeavor. And then finally, I don't know, no, there's one more. Knowledge base. So scientists, we get very specialized in our knowledge, whereas policymakers are forced to be generalists. They deal with policy topics and or scientific topics that span the spectrum, as we can actually see just in this group, right? We've got very different backgrounds in sort of expertise represented in this conversation, and a policymaker could interact with any one of you on the topic that you care about. This gets especially true, and why my passion is around the state and local level. At the federal level, there's a lot of resources in the United States devoted to scientists and engineers researching the questions that policymakers have. Legislative staffs in congressional or federal offices can be 20 to 30 people. They have designated committees. There's a lot of intellectual capital or people engaged in the science policy process at the federal level. At the state level, at least in North Carolina, and it's different across all 50 states to make it really easy to navigate. The state level in North Carolina, an example is that on average, a legislature, someone in a House and the Senate, is going to have one, maybe two staffers that work for them. And those people are primarily going to be responsible for scheduling, right? It's not really, or constituent services in terms of taking those meetings, but there's almost non-existent infrastructure for them to engage with scientists and researchers around topics that they care about. However, there is an interest from personal experience in being able to have better evidence and or interactions with the research community because the topics they cover are so broad, and they are not experts in those. And then finally, in general, I mentioned this briefly, in science, problems sort of drive the group, right? What kind of problem can we solve? What kind of problem is most interesting versus policy? What kind of services, what kind of programs can we develop and or provide? Usually to address a problem, but nonetheless, it's sort of around the services mentality. And so I do want to take a brief moment to at least acknowledge an example and put a point on the primary communication method, because it will be something that you all can kind of take away after this. Once you've developed your analysis, you'll have to talk to people. And if you want to talk to policymakers, here's a really exciting example of the PowerPoint. And so this person on Twitter was constantly amazed how prevalent slide decks are for influencing policy. And she provided in a tweet farther down in the thread a very specific example that I was excited to hear. I don't have any examples of where my slide decks have had this large of an impact, but I feel like it's a really good example, which is that there were 11 slides that convinced Boris Johnson about global warming, right? So through a bunch of digging, Carbon Brief was able to get access to those specific slides, and they're pretty good, but they're not too crazy. But it is important to recognize that the method you communicate, how many words you put on the slide, how you're engaging with your audience is extremely important. And it can have this big of an impact where you are able to take the work or research you're doing and package it up in a way that they can use it. So there are other reasons this was effective. It wasn't just the slides were amazing, right? There was other context and the people that were in the room and how they were delivered. But this was I thought it was a helpful illustration, especially when a lot of my scientist friends will not take nearly enough time to put together a succinct slide deck on the work that they're doing. I'm sure you are aware or have sat through I have 30 minutes and I'm going to go through 167 slides. Hold on to your seats, right? Anyway, so with that concludes sort of the context and the cultural differences between the science policy groups. And at this point, we wanted to open it up for reflections. I know, Joan, you already put one in the chat that you wanted to talk about. I'd love for you to say more, but has anybody from the group experienced or interacted with these cultural differences? And if so, is there a reflection you want to share about how you've navigated that or any sort of challenges you've faced with that? And I'll go ahead and jump to Joan to discuss a little bit about the Honest Broker first.
Okay, so I have that one, and then I have another one too. So we're at WVU, and we're in WVU, West Virginia. For those of you who don't know, it's one of the poorer states. and it's a very fraught political atmosphere right now. Currently one of our senators is the one holding up a lot of progressive legislation. It's going to get better, we hope, but have a lot of problems, and a part-time, very much part-time legislative situation, no high education level, very high school, basically, for the most part. So at WVU is the big university in a small, poor state. And so we have an obligation because of our mission, but also just because of our presence in the state, to have this honest broker approach. And so the honest broker means, my understanding is that we will show you all the alternatives. We will not advocate that you completely, for example, completely get rid of coal. We will show you the pros and the cons and the pros and the cons. And we will advocate that you pay attention to science when you make your decisions. I think that's as far as we can go in advocacy. We get into issues with our faculty who are very passionate about advocating. And so the faculty members who work with us, I have to explain to them that in our work, when they're working with us, we have to be the honest broker, but in their own roles, personal roles, they can do, as much picketing and that stuff as they want to, because, so I just wanted to put that out there. Because I noticed you had advocacy as part of the science policy thing, and Roger Pilkey says, no, that's not, that is separate from honest broker, when we all know that they're all connected. So
yeah, I think there's or the way that I would address this is, in general, sort of the science for policy is your primary sort of honest broker area that you were trying to provide a lot of the opportunity, or what is available. You're taking requests as opposed to just pushing out your perspective, right? So the Missouri, there's a recent article where they talk about their science notes is a really good example of trying to take this honest broker approach, where they only answer questions that are asked by the legislature, right? So they have to be sought out. And I think it's really important, and we'll get into this a little bit, and I would challenge a lot of the faculty members or the researchers you're working with to sort of consider a lot of the things that we're talking about today in terms of their theory of change, of how they want to actually make a difference. Because if they want to make a difference through advocacy, as you're saying, it's not going to be through the specific university structure or the structures that you have. That doesn't mean that they can't do that. And advocacy is one of the primary areas that, at least at present in the United States, a lot of the societies and or organizations working in science policy push people towards, right? So I know when I was a graduate student and or just in general, most of the time you're pushed towards going to a legislative action day, going to talk to your representative, and maybe in those meetings you're an honest broker, but in general, it's more on the advocacy side. And so I think it is an important piece to recognize. But having a clear understanding of what your goals are, and especially in the context of maintaining long-term relationships, it's important to take that trust perspective and to recognize that in terms of expertise, policymakers are experts on how policy is made, and you're an expert on your science, and that's great. And those are different, right? So, and so being able to take a step back and or allow for the policymakers to have their expertise show through in the conversation is extremely important. Anybody else have questions and or areas they want to dig into a little bit or reflect on? Also, welcome, Christian.
Just a quick a reflection on your point about the slide deck and effectively communicating that message. I mean, in my life in consulting, it's always all the large firms are trying to go for every major, and obviously they're all very competitive and close. So it's really important to have that message that you are the one that can deliver. It's kind of important in your half hour to do. So yes, that's kind of rings a bell about how important that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you just sparked something that Joan, I wanted to follow up on that point too. Is I got really good advice from a lobbyist friend of mine initially when I was starting on, which was that you have to build two different types of relationships, or two relationships with a policymaker, or really anybody, but for policy especially. You have to build a professional relationship, right? You have to show professionalism. You have to maintain a professional relationship, which means showing up, being there on a regular basis, not just dropping in once. And then two, you have to build an issue relationship, right? So you have to know if that issue is of importance to them. And if you don't have both of those, you're not likely going to be successful making an ask and or encouraging or advocating for particular direction if they don't have an issue relationship. So if you're going to a legislator or anybody and it's the first time, and well, one, it's the first time you're going, and two, they've never thought about the issue that you care about before, definitely don't make an ask, right? Like there should be no sort of ask in that initial conversation. So just thinking about how you might develop the issue relationship as well as the professional relationship, and that both need to be present and take time to develop before you can move forward and sort of have that co-creation or establishment of trust. And the slide deck is definitely for you, as an example of being able to meet them where they are, being able to provide them things that they're going to be able to need or use, right? Their audience is audience, right? When you leave the room, they have to go tell somebody about what they talked to you about. And if you're not leaving them with something that they can use to be able to talk about that thing, then they're stuck, right? So. Yes, Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm sorry for joining late. One thing I want to maybe highlight is the communication aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like being a scientist, it's important to know how to communicate the result of our research to policymakers, right? And they don't have time most of the time to read journal articles. So it's important to think of innovative ways, so that they will be able to get the message you are trying to convey. And one thing the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services does well is the summary for policymakers. After having a report, they have a document that write, which is the summary for policymakers, and that document is straight to the point, and then policymakers get the message. So yeah, that's one thing I wanted to add as well.
Thank you, Christian. Would you mind doing a slightly longer introduction? Tell us your name and where you're from geographically, as well as the organization that you're a part of, and then maybe a little bit about why you wanted to come.
Okay. My name is Christian Todota. I'm from Benin. It's a country in West Africa. And I work as a consultant for Kono Consulting, which is a co-production of knowledge for sustainability, consulting firm based in Germany.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. We're excited to have you.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you for bringing up the importance of science communication and or just communication in general as part of this. It will be a thing that we will not cover specifically in this particular workshop, but it will be throughout it, right? It's an extremely important aspect of how you do this work or how one does this work. And so thank you. Yes, Joe.
Sorry, I don't want to take all the floor time. Go ahead.
All right, Vanessa, we'll go with who we haven't heard from yet.
It's just a really quick comment also about about communication in general, because I think researchers are still learning how to present their information, their results to policymakers. And I feel that training in communication is missing in, universities, researcher centers, but just a quick comment about this. I also feel this, that something's missing in this relationship.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I agree. I think observed, I'm sure Joan can sort of speak to this as well, having worked with a number of researchers. There's a lot of opportunity, I would say, to improve for scientists in terms of their communication outside of, or even within, honestly, I will say even within the academia. As a scientist, I constantly who trained in biology, I cannot read a physics paper. I cannot read a computer science paper. I cannot read anything that is outside of my own discipline, because it takes 10 years worth of background knowledge to just be able to read the abstract, right? So I think even outside of academia, we obviously need a lot of help, but even within it, just to talk to our colleagues as we become more interdisciplinary, we're going to need a lot of formal training in terms of that process.
That's it.
I think
I'm sorry.
Just one more minute, Joe,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. No, I think it's a problem of context too, because here in Brazil, it's something new for us to scientists to help building science policies or something like that. So I think something related to where I am, from where I speak.
Yeah, of course. And actually really exciting. I appreciate you bringing up not only just communication, of course, between disciplines, but between languages too. I think I was at a recent conference that talked about how, as a community, as a research community, we need to do a better job of translating our work into multiple languages. Also, because I think there are a lot of us in the United States who are missing out from a lot of really cool research and science and work in the science policy engagement or engagement space that's happening outside of the US that we just have no context for, because it wouldn't make any sense for you to write it in English or someone to write it in English for their audience that speaks Portuguese or Spanish or whatever. And so how do we do a better job of proactively, not just from a like, oh, we need all of the English as a first language research articles translated into other languages. We also, as the United States, needs to recognize the experience and expertise outside of the US and proactively work to translate that work so that we can use it to help us be better too. Okay. Eric, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Unless there are any, I guess I should welcome our newest participant. Anna?
Yes, here I am.
Excellent. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, of course. I'm Anna. I work here in Mexico, in Michoacán. And I have been doing some projects of science communication since Science Cafe in Morelia, in the city. But also I started a new research project communicating energy in rural context. So this is a very interesting task and difficult task, no? Obviously, for this reason that you are talking about, what happens when you go with all your knowledge and from the university to rural context and try to communicate in other scenarios, no? That's interesting and difficult task too.
I agree. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are jumping into our next segment. Eric, you can take it away.
Hi, everybody. So we'll carry right on. Welcome. Bienvenidos a todos. So how to make a difference in science policy with your research, as you know, is the overall theme. I'm going to be introducing a few different topics within this. Before I do, I'll just briefly introduce my background. So I'm a social scientist. So my degrees are in communication and sociology. And I work as a civic science fellow in the United States at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which is how Andrew and I know each other. It's a program that cuts across a lot of different institutions involved at the kind of science policy, science communication interface. So they have a weekly program of activities and that kind of thing. It's funded by philanthropic funders in the United States that have an interest in science. So, and then I work for UNESCO on evaluation, in particular for a policy instrument called the Recommendation on Science and Scientific Researchers, which is an instrument that's aimed at improving the kind of science systems, and that the means of doing that is through changes in science policy to create a number of improvements around diversity of the science workforce, as well as things around open science and a range of kind of good things that are needed in the sciences. And this is a relatively newly refreshed policy instruments. So there's been one round of monitoring so far that member states, that countries around the world have participated in. And there's another one coming up. So that's just a little bit of what I'm doing now, and to indicate the kind of background I'm coming from. So I've done a lot of evaluation work, as well as consulting, particularly on science communication for a range of institutions, and also some public opinion research around attitudes towards science, things like that, as well as consulting work with research institutions, helping them to set up frameworks for their impact work around research impact, also reviewing research impact case studies in countries that have exercises where they officially measure research impact, and also supporting institutions in setting up evaluation frameworks for their policy impacts, as well as other kinds of impacts. Okay, so first I want to clarify, just to make sure we're all using the same terminology, because a number of times I'm going to mention the concept of impact or research impact. And what I mean by that is the difference that research can make in the world. So that's been defined in that way by Professor Mark Reed in the Research Impact Handbook, that impact is the good researchers do in the world. I think it's important to keep in mind that impact can be both positive and negative. The example that Andrew showed highlights that fact, but I think it's something we all know, but it's worth bearing in mind that, for example, poorly designed research communication can have a negative effect. So on to the first element for today, which is stakeholder analysis for science policy impact. So stakeholder analysis is about first thinking through the range of people, organizations that have a stake in your research. So who would be affected, who would be interested, who could be an ally, who could be a kind of enemy of the research actually making a difference in science policy. Thinking through the kind of players involved can be an important first step when designing an impact plan. So ideally, when it comes to policy impact, the most direct approach is when you can consult directly with policy stakeholders who would be end users of the research in order to align the research to their questions. That's the ideal scenario. It's not always feasible to do that, but that's one of the kind of best options when it is available. And in general, a stakeholder analysis allows you to have a better model of who's going to be involved here, who could support your work, who could you collaborate with when developing impact from your research, that kind of thing. We don't have to do impact alone. It doesn't, like, it works better as a kind of team sport than trying to struggle through and do everything alone. So thinking about who would be the end users and then who would be kind of potentially working with you to make a difference is a good idea. So a way of thinking about this is what has been called the 3 I's, again from Professor Reed's work. So this includes thinking through who is interested in your research or who could be interested in the research, who has an influence, either supporting or denying impact. So who could be involved in affecting the degree of influence that your research has, and then who is affected, who is impacted either positively or negatively by the research. And when you answer these questions, you get a pretty good idea of who are the stakeholders for your research impact. And the idea in doing this is that whether we intend to or not, we always have a kind of notion, an implicit idea of who we're trying to reach and who we're trying to have an impact with. And that is sometimes not the most accurate picture. So the more we can go from a kind of caricature, a kind of comic book notion of who we're trying to influence or who we're trying to reach, what their needs are, to actually fleshing this out into something like reality, the better chance we have of actually delivering impact with our work. So that's the general idea. Here's the kind of specific categories for you to work with when you're starting to do this. So essentially, you start with a list of organizations, groups, people, can be actual individuals as well. And these are people who you would answer in those three categories: interested, impacted, influential. And you rate how interested they're likely to be from high to low, and what aspects of the research are likely to be of most interest, and what level of influence they're likely to have on whether your research delivers impact or not. And the idea is that these two questions where you rate high to low, this then gives you a straightforward way. Once you fill out this list, you then have an easy way to prioritize engagement with stakeholders. So you can just start with those who are in the high category, for example, high interest, high influence. Those would be your first priority, that kind of thing. So it gives you a quick and easy way to filter and decide where do you start when it comes to engaging stakeholders for your research. We've just been discussing stakeholder analysis and its role in clarifying kind of your impact planning. And as I mentioned, we're kind of building up to ultimately getting to theory of change. I want to highlight at this point that one of the benefits of stakeholder analysis is that it can help us to avoid taking a kind of one-size-fits-all communication or engagement approach. Because once we do the stakeholder analysis, we start to see the differentiation in our target audiences, that they're not all at the same level, they don't all have the same interests, and that we can tailor our approach for engagement based on the interests and needs from each group. So one of the things that was raised in my breakout group was, how do you go from a kind of general kind of guess about what your stakeholders want or care about to like a reality, a real understanding of what they care about? And the most common way is through informal conversations. So kind of having a chat with, for example, policymakers in your kind of target area about what do they care about, what do they think is important. This kind of thing can help to align your understanding of the need, the research need, with reality better. The best case scenario is a kind of co-creation of the research agenda, where you involve the policy stakeholder or a representative policy stakeholder at the very earliest stage to help to define the research question even, so that you're orienting your approach in a way that's going to deliver the kinds of answers that are actually going to match up to the policy challenges and issues that are being faced. So this is what I would call a strategic approach to research impact, is where you are thinking of what approach am I going to use for this particular audience. So it's not a kind of default mode where you always use the same approach for everybody, but it's a more specialized approach where you select very deliberately a particular communication approach or mechanism, like for example, a workshop, or whatever it is, it's designed specifically for that category of stakeholder. And therefore, it's more likely to be effective than if you just kind of use a default model all the time. Okay, so impact objectives are important to clarify. And the reason that it's important to be very specific about the kind of impact that you're wanting to have is because you need to align your approach to that specific kind of impact. So this is again part of taking a strategic approach. And the idea is to think about realistically, what is the kind of impact that you would like to have? So if everything went really well, everything was very successful, what would that impact look like? How would people, how would your policy stakeholders be responding, and what would change as a result? So being clear about this also can help you identify what are the things that would make it less likely that this impact objective would be realized, and also to think about what would be the most direct pathway to get there. So what can, what realistically are going to be the effective modes of engagement? So one of the important distinctions here is between outputs and outcomes. So outputs are the thing you're doing to develop impact. So in research, a lot of times this is a report. And then outcomes are the changes that you want to see, whether that's a kind of change for particular policymakers or a change at a kind of organizational level, whatever the change is that you want to see. And the important thing is to match the thing you're doing to develop impact with the kind of impact you want to have. And sometimes there's a gap there. So for example, if you want your policymakers to actively engage with the research and understand the kind of implications, it might not be realistic to just send them a report or send them something to read. It might be a more wise approach to hold a workshop, something more active, where they can ask questions, where you can help to walk through the challenges with them, as opposed to just kind of sending them something that they're not going to have time or feel equipped to fully incorporate into their work. So bridging the gap between the research and the needs of the policymaker, the ways of doing that, there's a range of options, but it's important to think about the way that you develop impact as something that needs to be tailored to the kinds of outcomes that you're trying to deliver. And it should be realistic that taking these steps is actually going to get you to those outcomes. So to do that kind of thinking, you have to be really clear about the outcomes that you're targeting and about the impact that you're trying to have. So the idea here is to be as specific and explicit as possible about what it is that you're trying to affect, so the difference that you're trying to make. And this will be an important part of developing the theory of change as well. So this is the next thing that we're going to work on, is impact objectives, clarifying the kind of policy impact that you're aiming to have as unambiguously, plain language, explicit as possible. That's the idea with the next step. And I see there was a question from Joan about the co-creation and kind of co-creation with policymakers and the best way of doing that. I mean, the most common approach that I've seen and been involved in is co-creation workshops, where you kind of lay out the challenge, the issue, the topic, and then you walk through the setting of the agenda with the relevant stakeholders, and you kind of make your way through to conclusions step by step in a workshop format, whether that's a face-to-face or an online workshop. That's the most common way to go about it. All the other options, you would kind of have to have a good reason not to take a workshop approach, because that's the kind of default model.
If you're working with community members on difficult problems, and the science and the solutions are inherently technical, you bridge that gap. And we've had some stakeholder roundtables, and we found that, especially with engineering solutions, the stakeholders just say, we don't know anything about this, we're just listening, and they won't speak. So how do you go bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really common scenario when you're doing consultations or engagement with non-experts, and it is something that's like maximum challenging to do, kind of like the classic idea that writing a short, clear version of something takes a lot longer than writing a long, complicated version. So it does require a structure that is generally not led by scientists or engineers. So generally you would have an expert in public consultation, in public engagement, in science communication, leading the process and managing the process. So that includes a very strict editorial role on what content is presented. So for example, any content that overshoots the mark in terms of being overly complicated, making this issue sound like something you can't engage with, has to be screened out, because if you have any of it, you immediately will lose people in the process. So for example, one of the approaches that we take when we do this kind of thing is we'll pre-record and set up video explanation. So if there's content we have to explain, we prepare that in advance so that we can be super careful that there's nothing off-putting in the communication for the public participants. And then the kinds of things that we ask people, we're not asking them about things relating to the engineering. It's always things about their lives, about their values, their experiences. So those two elements are the kind of guiding principles. Is you never ask people to answer questions about the science or the engineering. You ask them to answer questions about themselves and their lives and what matters to them. And you never expose them to scientific jargon that's going to make them feel like they are not capable of engaging on the topic. And it's important to be careful about mixing groups, like having a scientist, for example, be the one doing the engagement with public participants. There has to be a good reason to do that, as opposed to having public consultation specialists doing it who are experienced in communication with the general public. And the temptation for scientists who are deeply enmeshed in a topic will be to start to explain things. And explaining things is the opposite of what you want in a consultation. You only explain the absolute minimum you have to be able to do the consultation properly. And those explanations have to be super accessible so that everybody gets it easily without feeling like they're less than. Andrew, did you want to comment on this? Oh, you're on mute.
I really thought I was going to make it through this workshop without that. I got my Zoom badge for the day. All right. Just to make a point or a suggestion is I do think it's valuable for scientists and researchers to experience those public engagements from a very viewer-esque and or not contributor perspective. So I would encourage you to consider ways to invite scientists to participate, especially in virtual contexts where they can essentially just serve as listeners. They have no ability to, as Eric mentioned, to inform the way that the conversation goes, but it is important for them to be able to see that as the conversation actually goes through and hear the piece that they wouldn't otherwise if you had them leading the conversation. So to Eric's point about being able to ask about their experiences, about the public's experiences, I do feel there's value in scientists being able to hear that, and seldom are they equipped to actually facilitate that piece. Anyway, just as there are structures that were examples of organizations who have created those spaces where they allow public audiences facilitated by an expert facilitator or science communicator or whoever needs to be, and allowed scientists to view only essentially that experience.
And that viewing process can also be from a recording. So
yeah, it doesn't have to be live.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because depends on how sensitive the topic is, how prone participants might be to even having a scientist in the room, making them adjust what they say. Some topics I'm more concerned about that than others. But in general, I more often than not just record the session and show the professionals or scientists later, what was said, and discuss the implications with the scientists, so we can have a viewing and then discuss implications amongst the scientists. But I agree in terms of like, if I was only thinking about impact on the scientists, it is healthy for them to have a live observation. It does probably stick a bit more, but I always prioritize making sure that the participants feel comfortable. So a lot of times I don't have them as a live observer. Okay, anything else anyone wants to raise?
I did have one other thing that would be helpful. I do think our breakout group was less primary researchers, where the day job is to the active research component, or informing policy with that lens, and more in the boundary spanning organization context. And I was wondering if you could at least speak to how to, or give a few tips for how to identify essentially that problem statement type of aspect for that organization who's not the primary researcher, right? This is a little bit easier when it's like clear, this is my research, I'm doing research on X and I want it to go Y. But if you could give a little bit of insight for our participants about how to frame that, given or at least frame their work, I guess, as a research question within the context of being the boundary spanner.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're a boundary spanner, effectively you end up being in the same location as the researcher anyway, because you're just kind of drawing out the researcher to, I mean, you're basically playing the role that I would play as a consultant with the researcher, where you're helping them to do exactly these kinds of things, to answer these kinds of questions, but you're in that role of drawing out the answers to these questions and asking them to be more specific, more explicit, less vague, and this kind of thing, which is my mantra every time I do one of these kind of consultation processes is, could you be a little more specific about what you're aiming to achieve? Could you be a little bit more specific about who you're aiming to engage? And then why do you think doing it this way is likely to give you the outcome that you think that you're looking for, that kind of thing. I'm just going to mention one point that came up in our breakout session and put the link in the chat. So I mentioned that there's some research. I did 2 rounds of research that was commissioned by an agency of the Australian government, looking at research impact case studies, where research data was used to develop impact. So one of those is, 2 rounds was published in the journal PLOS One. And the main finding was that you can't expect research to deliver impact on its own. It takes an extra layer of work. You either need to package up the information in a way that the end user can actually make sense of it and use it. So you kind of pre-specify the kind of utility in the research for that particular audience. That extra step is what makes the difference between data just sitting there unused and actually having it be something useful. So there are lots of different things that are used to deliver that kind of middle step. They can be mobile apps or databases, or sometimes a very tailored report or a video. There's many possible ways to get there, workshop, but for sure it takes some kind of intermediary step between the kind of core research, especially if it's kind of traditional academic research, and then actually having it make a difference in the non-academic space, including policy world. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take a 15-minute break at this point, and then we will reconvene for the last session on theory of change.
Hey, Eric, real quick, Joan had a quick question from our group.
Yeah.
So the question was how to separate the impact objective from the process of getting to the objective.
Yeah, it's really important to separate those things. So that did come up in our group as well, that there's a tendency when you're writing objectives to kind of mix in the how you get there part in the description. And it's important to separate those to make it more clear that there are different ways to get to the same impact outcome. So if you mix together the conduct a workshop to develop policy impact, if you mix those things together, then you're kind of diluting the fact that delivering this kind of policy impact could be done with a workshop, could be done with a video screening, it could be done with lots of different pathways. And so it's important to separate off the outcome that you're aiming for from the means to get there, so that you kind of really think strategically about, are these the right means to get to these ends? That's the idea. It also is helpful when it comes to evaluation, because you can use the same kind of evaluation to measure that outcome, regardless of which of the methods you use to get to that outcome. So you can compare the effectiveness of different approaches, for example. Okay, so now we're into the section about theory of change, which is the kind of the concluding concept and point for the workshop. So theory of change is a kind of comprehensive description or map or plan for how you develop impact. So the benefits of developing such a plan or model is that it helps to clarify the kind of the plan, the strategic notion of how doing step A is supposed to lead to step B. And if you have the right kind of conditions, that will deliver the outcome you want. So it allows you to develop a kind of a more complicated model sometimes, a multi-step model sometimes, that shows that delivering the kind of impact that you want sometimes is not a straightforward prospect. So sometimes it's not as simple as like give a lecture and then you get the impact you want. There are different things involved, including stakeholders. So it might be that you engage other people who then deliver the kind of impact that you're looking for. There are a range of possibilities. So for each kind of situation and each kind of impact that you're looking to develop, you have a theory of change that maps out how that's supposed to work. And this gives you an opportunity to critically assess your idea of how impact will develop, as well as to identify what are the points in this plan that could be improved, that could be extended. Are there any missing steps, for example, that kind of thing. So theory of change is something that you can do as part of an evaluation process to clarify what the kind of planned pathways to impact are. And then that also helps to highlight where you would evaluate to see whether things are playing out as intended. So this is also kind of acknowledging that in most situations, we cannot evaluate everything and whether everything's working to deliver impact as intended, but we can evaluate something. And theory of change lets us kind of clarify where evaluation could do the most good, where we could collect a feedback survey here, or do an impact focus group there, and then we can get some insights that will help to clarify and improve our theory of change. So the idea with theory of change is to avoid a missing middle where you have a kind of activity that you're doing and then an outcome that you want, and then there's some kind of gap between the two. And this is something I've seen quite a lot in over many years of research impact consulting. That there are often these kind of missing middles, and the theory of change can help to surface those missing middle steps. So a good theory of change covers the whole range from step to step to step to get to the impact that you want. And it gives an indication of why something is supposed to work. So what are the kind of factors that enable impact to happen? The kinds of questions that you answer when you're developing a theory of change are, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Who am I trying to engage? Who is my key audience? And that may or may not be the very end user that you're trying to affect. For example, in some cases, there may be a goal to benefit students in school, and they might do that via teachers. So the key audience might be the teachers, not the students in some cases. And the same may be true with policymakers, where even though they're the main audience at the end, like the people that you want to influence, there may be intermediary steps along the way to get there. What is your entry point for reaching your audience? So how can you get your audience to care? Why should they take an interest in what you're trying to offer and what your research shows, that kind of thing? And then, of course, what difference do you want to make? So you'll notice that quite a lot of these questions we've already kind of covered to some extent in the previous session. So with stakeholder analysis, we start to clarify who the key audience is, who might be involved. With impact objectives, we're clarifying what is the problem we're trying to solve and what are the ultimate outcomes that we want to deliver. And then the extra element that we're adding here is what steps are needed to bring about the change. So mapping out those steps, and it's probably not going to be just one step. There's probably more than one in most cases. And it's worth, like when you're doing this, you can think about what are some of the paths not taken? What are some of the alternatives that could be used here that I considered or didn't consider, but could actually be used here? And could one of those be better tailored to the situation? An ideal situation is if you can actually co-produce a theory of change with stakeholders. So this is often not feasible, but just to mention that in some cases, at the early stages, you can actually work with stakeholders, you can convene a focus group, and you can ask them to work with you to develop a theory of change, or at least parts of it, so that you have a kind of a diverse range of experiences and expertise that are helping to shape your model of how you develop and deliver impact. And then more often, this has to be done from the kind of perspective of the researcher or the research impact professional, identifying the steps that are needed to deliver impact, and then trying to ensure that there aren't missing elements. So this is the worksheet for this step, for the theory of change. And it has the questions I just mentioned. The idea, the way this fits into strategy, is that it's easy to kind of go down a certain road because that's what you're used to, or that's what you assume is the right thing to do. And then to find later on that actually there could have been a more direct pathway to impact. There could have been a more effective option. There could have been just one tweak to the strategy or the plan that could have made things work a lot better. And the idea with theory of change is you give yourself a fighting chance to see those issues at the early stages before you've invested a lot of time and resource in going down one route that you could have, if you'd kind of taken a little bit of extra, kind of critical examination of your plans, you could have seen that never really was going to work. So that's the kind of immediate payoff of a theory of change, is that it can save you from going down the kind of wrong road for delivering impact. And then the general benefit is that you can develop a more strategic approach, and you also lay the groundwork for evaluation to test whether things are actually working as you expect, because the theory of change already kind of sets the table for identifying things that could be evaluated to see how you can develop your approach better in the future. Okay, so I'm just going to show one example from a recent project that we've done at Institute for Methods Innovation. So this is with a research center focusing on water research in Scotland. And here we help them develop actually a series of theories of change, because they do a lot of different projects that are aimed at policy impact. And one of the kind of key, so just to note the categories here, in the red is the impact activity. In the yellow are enabling factors that help to kind of set the conditions for successful impact. Blue is the intermediate outcomes. So sometimes there are outcomes that are kind of on the way to delivering the ultimate impact that's desired. And then the green is the kind of ultimate impact, the actual benefits at the end of the story. So we develop these theories of change through doing interviews with both internal people within these institutions, so with researchers and with those who are working to kind of develop this impact, and also external stakeholders. So we interviewed policymakers who are involved in this process to get a kind of two views on this process from both sides. And then we also held participatory workshops with both groups of people to check that we had understood correctly what the process was. So one of the things that kind of defined the successful approach to delivering impact for this center in general is that they tend to involve the policy stakeholders very early on. So at the stage of defining the research brief, so the approach to like what exactly is the question that they want answered, that is done with policy stakeholders and primarily prioritizing what the policy stakeholders want to know. And then that helps to define the proposal that goes in. It's all kind of, everything's kind of set in a direction that's more likely to have policy impact because it started with actual policy stakeholders talking about what they need to know in order to solve problems in their policy context. And then enabling factors are things like how the information is actually delivered once results start coming out. So it's particularly likely to be effective if those policy stakeholders who helped set the agenda are also involved in ensuring that it actually delivers impact once the research comes out. So that means that they need to understand the research. Things like workshops are very helpful for kind of bringing them along to kind of get them involved in the policy impact process themselves as people, as allies for delivering the impact. And then that helps to push things along towards getting to the ultimate impacts that they're after. So that's just an example that's particularly elaborated. I'm not expecting you to get that far today. The idea here would be to start mapping out some of the steps to get to the impacts that you're wanting, and then to start to discuss and get feedback on your theory of change. Jen?
I have a question.
Yeah,
So
please.
you talked about getting the policy stakeholders involved early. Are you talking about government entities? And there's been a concern that some of us have talked about that that might lead to partisan. I mean, even if someone's in a state agency, say, I think at the federal level, it's not such a big deal here, but in the state agencies, because of the partisanship, even getting a member of the state executive agencies involved could be seen as a partisan thing. And we worry about that. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I think this is kind of similar to the issue with the kind of community consultations, that you have to kind of tailor what you're asking of people. So yes, I am talking about like people in agencies, in government agencies being asked to define the research question. And in some cases, it would make sense for legislators to do that as well.
Yes, yes.
But the focus would be on clarifying what are the questions that are being asked. So not how do we investigate these questions? That is for the researchers to propose, and then for, in this case, the research institution that is kind of a broker here to select what they think will be the best way to address the question on research terms. So there's a division of labor here between defining what do we need to know, what are the questions we need answers to in order to feed into policy. That's a question for policymakers. And then separate is the question of what would be the best way to actually answer those research questions, what would be the best methods, given the constraints on time and resources. That's a researcher question, and that's the kind of separation that happens.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Vanessa.
Yes. Look, if it's right, you have one theory of change for each situation, and not one for example, science communication projects, and you have a big model to follow. No, it's one for each situation, right?
Yeah, and in particular, yeah, basically each situation, but especially each distinct set of impact objectives. So if your end goal is the same, and then you're going to come up with your theory of change for how your organization or how your project is going to work that out, what steps you're going to take. It may be that somebody else who had exactly the same impact objectives might try a different approach to get there. And so that's why you would need your own distinct theory of change for each kind of impact development initiative. So I'm just going to conclude the workshop. I mean, obviously, you will not have been able to complete your theory of change in that session. This is just kind of jumpstart your process that we'll need to continue after. But just to conclude, we have, I just have some final points to kind of summarize. So effectively what we've been going through today is an evidence-based approach to developing policy impact. So the idea is, first of all, to be targeted. So not taking a kind of, we always do it this way, so this is just the way it is, this is our approach we always use, but tailoring your approach to the specific type of audience and the type of stakeholder. So clarifying in a differentiated way what you're trying to achieve with whom. This allows you to take a strategic approach so that you can match the way you engage people with what their needs are. And this then will increase the probability of success. To finish this loop, you would ideally be, once you have your theory of change, you would then be collecting evaluation evidence to check at key points in the plan, is this actually delivering the impact that we think? Is it playing out as we think? So for example, if you have a workshop walking people through research findings, you would, in the feedback survey, you would check whether that was clear, whether people understood what was being communicated clearly, whether they could see the relevance to their work. Things like this would help to tell you whether your theory of change is playing out as it's supposed to, as it's expected to, or are there some adjustments that are needed? So ultimately, ideally, you have this kind of evidence-based loop where you start with your theory of change, you gather feedback evidence or impact evidence to see if it's working, and that feeds back into your theory of change, etc. So that's the general idea. That's the kind of concluding point for the workshop, but Andrew and I can stick around after if you'd like to chat further. And yeah, there's Andrew's emails in the chat, and mine's up on the slide there, or was on the slide, but I'm fairly easy to find on Google.